Joining us live in studio is Mr. Julio Laredo from Tradition Family Defense of the Tradition Family and Property. He's normally hanging out in Rome, Italy, but today he's here with us in studio. Good morning to you, Mr. Laredo.
Oh, hello, and good morning to everybody. It's so great to be here. I've participated in your program so many times, but it's the very first time that I'm here in presence, so it's a great joy. It's a great joy for me to be here.
Praise be to Jesus. I guess you're on speaking tour here in the United States.
I'm on speaking tour, presenting this book on liberation theology. We just had a couple of conferences in California. We'll have 3 conferences here in Texas, and this tour will end in Washington, D.C. On Saturday, and then I might come back on October for the next leg of this presentation tour.
Excellent. Praise God. So the book is called Liberation Theology, How Marxism Infiltrated the Catholic Church. Tell us about your book.
Well, I will begin with one thing that maybe you don't know, that everything began here in Texas, in the sense that I began to write this book having in mind what the so-called Catholic left was doing here in Texas, and speaking of the mid-1980s, in which the liberation theology movement got in a very close symbiosis with the Alinsky-inspired People's Organizations Network, and they began to do things which the Catholic left normally does, for example, in Latin American countries. But this was very, very new for the American public, so they asked the American TFP to do some research, to do some studies, and that was the beginning of all. Then the whole liberation theology thing just sort of shrank because, first of all, Pope John Paul II condemned liberation theology in 1984. Then their paradises began to, paradises meaning the communist countries, began to fail one after the other. The Iron Curtain fell, etc. And the whole thing just sort of shrank. But already in 2011, 12, 13, the whole thing began to be reproposed. And then with the election of Pope Francis, that was interpreted as a comeback of all these movements. So I decided to retrieve this book, which was already written original in English and translated into Italian. And it was presented in 2014 in Rome. So now this presentation tour is sort of going back to the origins. Because this was a book intended for the United States.
Got it.
There's so many movements within the church that maybe we've never heard of before. What exactly is liberation theology for those who have never heard of it before?
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I always say, and that's how I begin the presentation of this book, is this: we're Catholics, and so everything that happens to Holy Mother Church is automatically the most important thing that can happen in the world. Now, that Holy Mother Church is in the throes of an immense and terrible crisis that's there for everyone to see. All the popes have spoken about, etc. Now, when you begin to study the roots or the origins or the causes of this crisis, people tend to go to the 1960s, as if the 1950s were paradise and then the 1970s were hell. And it's not like this. I mean, liberation theology is a part of a centuries-old process called the Revolution, which also infiltrated the church. So in my book, I trace the roots of liberation theology, and that's the subtitle, How Marxism Infiltrated the Church. And I begin my analysis with liberal Catholicism in the 1800s, modernism, new theology, so-called Nouvelle Théologie, on the philosophical and theological level. On the other hand, there was a movement of leftward social activism that began with social Catholicism, became democratic Catholicism, became Christian socialism, out of which comes liberation theology. So you see, it's a whole series of movements whose defining element is wanting to destroy the church, wanting to destroy her structure, wanting to destroy her doctrines, wanting to destroy the very instruments that she uses for the salvation of our souls.
You know, you made a great connection to the French Revolution in an article on the very same subject. And I think it can't be stated enough how bad the French Revolution was for the world, but for the church herself.
Yes, historians, especially French and European historians, showed that the French Revolution was essentially anti-Catholic, and therefore it was anti-monarchist. Their motto, we know liberty, equality, fraternity, but the real motto is revolution would not triumph until the last priest is hung with the entrails of the last noble. There's no priests and no nobles. This is the radical, egalitarian, and libertarian spirit of the French Revolution. Now, unfortunately, well, it was condemned by the Popes, Pius VI, Pius VII, etc. But unfortunately, there was a current of Catholics who wanted to embrace the ideals of the French Revolution, seeing in the French Revolution the wave of the future. And this is what defines all these movements that I've been mentioning. Their craving, I wouldn't just call it a desire, but it's a real craving of adapting the church to modern times, or better, to a particular ideological interpretation of modern times. And this is why Pius IX, Blessed Pius IX, when he condemned liberal Catholicism, he said, it's the party of those who wants to baptize the revolution.
Mr. Julio, I was thinking about this. I just went on a trip to Florida, and St. Augustine, Florida, beautiful, beautiful church there, the Basilica right there in St. Augustine. But, when I was there, it shook me because there is a ginormous sign about Amoris Laetitia and something about the environment and how to be true Christians, we needed to care for the environment. And of course, we have to be stewards of what God is giving us. But what is a practical application of this liberation theology that we're seeing right now?
Well, the thing is this, why liberation? Because they begin their analysis from this view, this dialectical view, which they inherit directly from Marxism. Everything in life is dialectical. Everything in life is a fight. So, of the oppressed against their oppressors. So, liberation theology wanted to, quote, liberate the proletarians by doing a revolution against the bourgeoisie, communism. But already in 1980, they did a World Congress of Liberation Theologians in Maryknoll in New York. And they said, well, communism is going down the drain, so we have to change things. So they began to adapt that same dialectical view to other situations of, quotations, oppression. So women are oppressed by men, feminist liberation theology. Certain races, blacks, Indians, are oppressed by the white race. So they say black liberation theology, indigenous liberation theology, and so on. And finally, they came out with the idea that the earth is oppressed by man and needs liberation. So from there comes the so-called eco-liberation theology or ecological liberation theology, which was very, very strong with this former Franciscan friar, Leonardo Boff, who wrote part of the Laudato Si encyclical.
Yeah. I would add to that list, though, gender liberation, because now we're seeing, like there's a story in the news today, a mom of 3 kids found out the hard way that her 12-year-old was being groomed by teachers, the principals, the faculty at her daughter's school, and nobody wanted to do it. The school board doesn't even want to do anything about it. It was a part of an LGBTQ transgendered private secret thing, and this is happening every day all across our country here in the United States, but I imagine it's happening around the world.
No, absolutely. Just what I said. I mean, the central idea is that anything that hinders the free flow of your sentiments, of your desires, of your cravings, is oppressive, and you have to liberate yourself from that. Now, homosexuals, they say, are oppressed by morals. They are oppressed by bourgeois mentality. So they say they need liberation, and therefore they've developed the so-called gay liberation theology.
Yeah. So many in the church, as you've already stated, have embraced this liberation theology. There's that famous footage of John Paul II on the tarmac, chewing out a Jesuit, not in clerics, by the way, chewing out a Jesuit on the tarmac because of his embrace of liberation theology. Where are we at as a church?
Father Ernesto Cardenal, he was Minister of Culture of the Sandinista government, and he had declared just weeks before communism and the kingdom of God are one and the same thing. So he actually deserved to be scolded.
Yes, he did. Well, him and his brother, by the way, both participated in that.
Exactly.
But it doesn't seem like anything's changed.
No, well, he just died recently. But the thing is what's the importance of all this? I would like to very quickly mention this. This is not a theoretical book. This is not a theoretical analysis, because with this type of reasonings, they actually get Catholics involved in all the revolutionary causes. And this is the important part. Catholics who would normally be mainstream Catholics and would do what every Catholic should do, that's pray, go to Mass, frequent the sacraments, and do good. They changed their mentalities through a process called consciousness raising or conscientization, which is part of the liberation theology movement. And through this, they actually managed to involve so many Catholics in the revolutionary causes. And that's what was happening, and is happening even today in the United States, particularly here in Texas, where this movement, this liberation theology movement, is very closely intertwined, very closely united with the Saul Alinsky-inspired network of people's organizations. Because Saul Alinsky, already in the 1930s, he said, revolution would not come about in the United States without the church. We have to work with the church. And he already back then began to work with the left sectors of Catholic Action that's in Chicago, so-called Chicago Experience. And that comes all the way up to now. I mean, the Delaney Grace Tract, for example, the 1960s in California, which spearheaded a whole movement of revolutions, land reform, and socialism. Well, that was inspired by liberation theology, Alinsky.
Yeah. Well, we're getting down to the wire here. So you've got a series of lectures that you're still doing here in the state of Texas, but you're also going to Washington, D.C. soon. So what are the dates there?
Well, today we will be having the presentation here in Houston, tomorrow in Austin, and then the next day in Dallas or Fort Worth. And then on Washington, D.C. would be on Saturday. And that will be the end of this tour.
Of this leg of the tour. So if you want information about that, we would encourage you to contact Mr. Cesar through their Facebook page. If you go to facebook.com/tfp.south, you'll be able to find contact information, but they're also going to post all of the details on the lecture tour if you're at all interested. So if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, I know that's as far up north as we can get. We can't get all the way to New York or Massachusetts, but maybe you can come down. It'd be an excellent opportunity. Go to facebook.com/tfp.south for that information. Based out of Rome, but you're from Peru, I understand.
I was born in Peru, and I also have the Spanish citizenship, but I'm a Peruvian born.
Oh, so you're a citizen of Spain itself as well.
Exactly, yes.
Interesting. Very fascinating. So Peru, let's talk about Peru for a moment. Peru is a very beautiful country. How often do you get to go back?
Oh, well, I actually stayed out of Peru for about 35 years.
Oh, wow.
Because one of the stories behind the story, which I, by the way, tell in the preface to this book, is that we, as Tradition Family Property in Peru, which was called back then Tradición y Acción, Tradition and Action, we made the first ever campaign against liberation theology in Peru, where liberation theology was launched. I'm speaking about 1973. Well, back then, there was a military communist government in Peru, and the government began to persecute us. So they actually drove us into exile. So in the 6th of August 1974, at the very ripe age of 18, I had to flee my country.
Really?
Persecuted by the communist government, and I didn't go back till 2005 or 6.
Oh, wow. I bet a lot had changed in that time.
A lot had changed for the worse and for the better in some aspects, yes.
Yeah, Peru's on my bucket list. I would love to visit Peru. It's a very beautiful country.
It's a very beautiful country. Unfortunately, now we are having some political problems because there are people who are now in power and would like to repeat that horrendous experience that we had in the late 60s and 1970s.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Laredo has written a book called Liberation Theology, How Marxism Has Infiltrated the Catholic Church. You can find it linked up at store.tfp.org, by the way. I encourage you to get a copy. I'm getting a copy. I can't wait to read it myself. Thinking about Latin America, though, in particular, it seems the whole world is going back to paganism. I believe that to be true. But in particular, it's kind of heartbreaking because in many ways, Latin America is sort of like the last stronghold of Christendom.
It was, actually. Pius XII once said that the evangelization of Latin America was the greatest missionary epopee in history after the founding of the church. Latin America was called the cardinal red continent because it was massively Catholic. Unfortunately, today, the percentage of Catholics is waning, but we're way down. In Brazil, it used to be 97, 98%, all the way down to the 1960s. Now it's around 60. And
Wow.
one of the problems, one of the reasons is liberation theology. That is, there is an analyst, a writer, who said that the church made a preferential option for the poor, and the poor made a preferential option for the evangelicals. That is, because liberation theology and all those that follow liberation theology speak almost exclusively of social issues and poverty and politics, and what the people want is to hear the word of God. So if they don't hear it from the lips, in the places where they should hear that, at the Catholic Church, they go somewhere else. So you would be true that Latin America is the great basin for the Catholic Church, but that is ceasing to be so, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the United States, we think of the immigration crisis here and how our borders have been overrun. And I often think about not necessarily the worst elements of that, but really the folks coming across that border that are looking for a better life in America. I don't blame them for that. I mean, I too would look for a better life if I had the opportunity to do so. And I think about how they have a unique opportunity if they would hold fast to their Catholic faith, if they embrace the fullness of what the church teaches about the Catholic faith and brought that to America, that could be a good thing. But that's not what we see. In the immigration history of America, it's almost never been the case where you had Irish immigrants, you had Italian immigrants, you have immigrants from all across Europe, Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all these places that have come in waves over the centuries. They come here and they become just like everybody here. They end up as liberal, as secular as everybody here already. They don't change America. They become America.
America changes them.
Yeah.
It's true, and and this is one point that I deal with in my book, so-called Americanism, which is not American patriotism. It's not to be a true blue American. It's a heresy called Americanism, condemned by Pope Leo XIII, and it's a whole vision of things which is, as you say, very liberal. Egalitarianly democratic, because we all know democracy is a perfect, legitimate form of government, as Leo XIII taught very clearly. But there's a concept of the democracy that any difference, any separation, any hierarchy is essentially anti-democratic, and that's not so. Well, this egalitarian view of religion, which Leo XIII condemned as Americanism, unfortunately infiltrated the Catholic Church. Modernism arose from the American spirit, and that's one of the points that I deal with in this book. And it's the desire of Americanizing the church. One of the foremost Americanists, Bishop John Ireland, says we have to embrace the American spirit. Now, what is the American spirit? And in this sense, I think that there is a wrong interpretation of what the United States actually are. It's a wrong interpretation, as if it were an exclusively liberal, egalitarian country. It's not like that. It's beautiful traditions, beautiful things that we have to embrace, enhance, and carry forward. So it's the adaptation, rather, to a special interpretation of the American spirit.
I guess it's probably hard for Americans, especially Catholics in America, because we want to be patriots, love our country as well we ought to be. But at the same time, I think too often we're more married to our political ideology than we are to our Catholic faith. And I say, I want to be Catholic, let the chips fall where they may.
In that sense, I think that the United States will have to receive a very profound grace, because you see, when you speak about the Reign of Mary in France or in Spain, it can't be very different from what Catholic France was or Catholic Spain was. Now, how can you conceive the Reign of Mary in the United States? You see that there has to be somehow a grace that will be given, and I'll say will be given, because I'm positive that it will be given by providence, whereby all these factors that we see now in the United States, including immigration, will somehow coalesce around a Catholic ideal, and will give rise to not a new nation, but something that will finally come to completion. And all this mightiness, all this power, all this wealth, and everything that the United States have will be put at the service of the good cause.
Yeah.
You might think that this is millennialism, or this is just a dream, but I'm sure that Providence, having given this country everything it has, will take this to completion with the full conversion of America.
Mr. Julio, that's a very interesting point you bring up there about what it'll look like in the reign of Mary, because I was just thinking about this the other day. The traditional movement has two massive points in the world, and that's, I think, France and here in the U.S. And France makes a lot of sense. It's the eldest daughter of the church, has a huge aspect of tradition that's just there in its bones. But then America has no Catholic tradition here. Our tradition has been severed, and there's not really a massive well to dig from about bringing back tradition. So you see American Catholics taking some French traditions, taking some English Catholic traditions, taking some Spanish Catholic traditions, and kind of creating this these traditions that were lost that we don't have organically. And so it seems almost like a inorganic tradition that we have in the U.S. versus other countries, and the other traditional movements across the world kind of look at America and like, y'all are just kind of being silly about the way y'all approach tradition. What's your perception about this kind of thing?
That's a very deep point, a very, very deep point, because you see, tradition in Europe exists since the beginning of the Middle Ages and even before, we can say, but it's contaminated by all sorts of local problems. For example, when you raise the issue of the traditional liturgy, I live in Milan, by the way. I very frequently go to Rome, but I live in Milan. In Milan, we don't have the Roman rite. We have the Ambrosian rite. Mm. And you can't imagine the type of friction that comes with the real Ambrosian traditionalists vis-a-vis the Roman rite. So,
wow.
Europe is full of this type of, I would call them, petty problems. The United States don't have that, so they can they can permit themselves to look at tradition with eyes that some people can consider naive, as you said, but I think it's pure eyes. I mean, the beauty of tradition, the goodness of tradition, the truth of tradition in itself, without all those historical problems, for example, all the wars between France and Germany, all the bad feelings between Spaniards and French. You know, in Spain, they say that thanks God that God created the Pyrenees in order to separate us. You know.
Divine intervention.
Well, in Italy, this is absolute. For example, take Pisa and Lucca, which are about 30 miles away.
Oh, wow.
The Pisans said, it's better to have a dead man at home than a Lucan at your door.
Wow.
Ouch.
30 miles away.
30 miles
That's like
away.
going to
Well,
my parents'
wow.
house.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of thing the United States don't have. And this is why I think the United States are in a unique position to contemplate tradition with pure eyes, pure meaning uncontaminated eyes with all these things, and go to the essence of what tradition and what Christian civilization is. Because it doesn't come with this concrete historical petty problems, as I call them.
Yes, the United States is rather young. You know, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about liberalism. It seems that liberalism has a very deep root here in our country, specifically with our governance. And why was the church? Why did the church condemn this concept?
Well, it's very simple. First of all, there is something called objective truth. So as much as you are free to believe what you want, you are not free to believe in error. Now, what does this mean? For example, I don't know if the webcam is working, but I'm holding a rosary. Am I free to call this a buffalo? I'm free in the sense that nobody will kill me for calling this a buffalo, but it's wrong. So I cannot go outside of reality. Liberalism cannot give me the right to call things by what they are not. I have to call this a rosary. Why? Because objectively speaking, real, this is a rosary. Well, second point, how can I have the right to act according to what I think if the ideas are wrong or bad, and I act according to them? Because an idea is incomplete, you have to act upon your own ideas. And if I think that, God forbid this, that I think that some race, for example, has to be exterminated because I don't like them, they give me freedom to think like that, but they don't give me freedom to act like that. So between thinking and acting, there is a very intimate relation. So you see, there are manifold logical problems and philosophical problems and theological problems when you adopt this wrong idea of liberty. We are free, but we have to accept the consequences of our choices. And we are free to choose the several paths that will take us to our goal. And this is the problem with the revolutionary concept of liberty, which is called liberalism.
Right.
Yeah. Master Baker, number 78, our friend from Midland, Texas, who runs, I think it's Tony's, if I'm not mistaken, Tony's up there, says, how much of an obstacle is the fall of meritocracy among our youth? Will this become a socialist generation?
I think it's already becoming a socialist generation, as we see, because in such a way, the state and the higher bodies are encroaching upon the real freedoms, the real liberties, and the real possibility of doing things of the rank and file people. For example, we just had a talk with a rancher, I think of North Carolina, and he spoke about all the problems that farmers encounter because of state regulation. Now, that creates a socialist mentality, which is against meritocracy, because you can be as worthy of merit as you may be. If you cannot give way to that merit and make it work, it's useless. So absolutely, yes, we are heading and very, very quickly towards a socialist mentality.
You know, it always blows my mind how young people, or any people really, embrace this, not just liberation theology, but socialism and communism. They act like what we're seeing. And every time I see someone with a Che Guevara shirt on, my mind is blown at how they could be so ignorant to the actual difficulties and evilness of those communists that they applaud.
Well, and this is a very important point, and this makes the subtitle of the Italian version of the book, which is Liberation Theology, a lead-laden life vest for the poor. I mean, the poor are drowning in poverty, and you give them a life vest, which is actually lead. Why? Because, you see, they say that they make a preferential option for the poor. But if you see country by country where they have implemented their ideas, the result has been utter poverty. Well, they actually tackled this problem in a World Congress they had in 1990. They say, we are defending economic and political systems that bring about poverty. We have to admit that. We have to accept that. And the conclusion was that they are not in favor of the poor. They are in favor of poverty. And this goes back to the Marxist concept of hierarchy. How is hierarchy made? It's because some have more and some have less. So the only way of having equality, which they say is a value, is that nobody has anything or nobody has nothing. It's a double negative. But anyway, so they actually defend the principle of poverty. And this is why the latest version of liberation theology, the so-called indigenous theology, they actually defend as the model for our society, the tribal societies in the Amazon. Someone would say, well, this is absolutely nuts. This is crazy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we had a synod in Rome, the Pan-Amazon Synod, which proposed the indigenous lifestyle as the goal that we have to pursue. Why the indigenous life, the Amazonian Indians, not even the more civilized Indians? Because they don't have property. They don't have government. They don't have hierarchy. They don't have structures. And this is the end goal. And this brings us back to the original Marxist ideology. If we read Engels, The Origin of the Property, Family, and the State, it says problems began when men began to appropriate things. First, they appropriated women, thus the family. The family is nothing else but the private property of women. Some men appropriated the means of production. Therefore, it divided society between the have and the have-nots. Some appropriated the means of the means of power, and that is the origin of the state. So Engels says, if we want to establish communism, we have to go back to the tribal societies, and he sets as a model. I don't know why. Maybe he knew them better than others. The Iroquois Indians from Canada. Mm-hmm. So tribalism has always been in the horizon of communism, and this is now being proposed at the highest level, because when we speak of a Roman synod with the presence of the Pope, we're speaking of the highest levels in the church, and this is what they're being proposed. So you see, when you speak about liberation theology, it's not strictly speaking 1960s and 1970s Latin American liberation theology. We're speaking of the whole panorama of the crisis in the church and the whole panorama of where they are wanting to take the church.
That's fascinating. You know, the highlighting of this tribal lifestyle as unique and really the pinnacle of lifestyle is something that you mentioned, Joe, is people returning to paganism. They idealize this lifestyle of the old, and they forget the savageness of that lifestyle, the things that were tamed by the coming of Christianity.
Yeah, but they say this, that God gave two revelations. There was a primitive revelation embedded in nature. Well, at a certain point, man sinned against this primitive, original, and therefore the revelation. And therefore, God mercifully gave us a second revelation, which was that recorded in the Holy Scriptures. Now, we have to interpret, they say, the revelation in Holy Scriptures in the light of the primitive revelation. Now, they say, there were peoples who never sinned against primitive revelation, and those are the Amazonian tribes. Mm-hmm. So it's them who have to evangelize us, not the other way around. Again, you will say that these are crazy ideas. There was a whole synod done in Rome around this type of ideas.
You know, Mr. Julio, I was just thinking, as you're saying that, I had received a letter of someone very angry with me because I did a podcast about the abortion issue and talking about the need to overturn Roe v. Wade and abolish abortion in the U.S. And the person came back and said, I think this is absolutely horrible what you're doing here, claiming to speak for all Catholics and saying that we have to be pro-life and not pro-choice. And the idea that they were getting across was actually that, you know, if we're really Catholic, we would have to support socialist ideas. We'd have to support these welfare programs to help people. We have to promote all these ideas and socialistic movements in the government and welfare programs that would help, quote unquote, unmarried women, children that were born in foster cares and things like this. And obviously the instinct is, well, of course we want to help people, but at the same time, there seems to be an element there that is trying that underlying current that just seems wrong. How would you respond to that? Because it seems like it's connected.
But here there are two points. First of all, you can answer that he's very ignorant, because many people who criticize us for not doing this and not doing that simply don't know Catholic social doctrine. I would go back to the encyclicals of Leo XIII, encyclicals of all the popes, all the way down to John Paul II, who has some very beautiful and very good encyclicals on social issues. There's the Catechism of the Social Doctrine of the Church, just as there is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So go and read that, and that is the source of any Catholic truth that we can state in social issues. Now, there are some basic points that Catholic social doctrine stresses. First of all, the defense of the right to private property. Mm-hmm. This is something that we are, for example, we're somewhat sometimes criticized as tradition, family, property. Well, tradition, yeah, family, okay, beautiful, but why property? Well, the answer is very simple. There are two commandments that uphold private property, 7th and 10th. So if God used 20% of the space, so to speak, he had available in order to uphold private property. Now, so the right to private property, which is denied by socialism, by communism, by all these doctrines. Then the right to free enterprise, because man is free to do whatever he needs to do to fulfill his own natural ends. Now, one of the natural ends is that you have to be able to eat. You have to be able to raise a family. Everything that is within our nature becomes a right, a primary right. Then comes the application, which is the secondary right, and that can have some modifications. So, and the state cannot encroach on this primary rights. Now, what is the problem with these socialist programs? That they giving out money for free without educating those people to go on their own. They're actually pushing these people into poverty.
Yeah, yeah.
You should give money to educate. You should give money to young people who want to create their own business. You have to give money for people to go to school, to go to college, etc. To farmers. No, we were speaking about farms. That would be a Catholic approach to things, not the state encroaching on everything and financing everything.
Yeah. You know, that statement was just ringing in my ears as you were talking, is you will own nothing and be happy, you know, and embracing this sort of liberation theology or socialism or communism or, you know, communalism almost, we find ourselves being sort of pinned, you know. That's why I was asking the rancher whether or not he felt like the future could include mom and pop farms. Is it even going to be possible moving forward? They're making it so hard for families to own property. In our country, if you owned a ranch that goes all the way back, like you know, the property that my parish is sitting on, that's a property that was gifted to that family by Sam Houston after Texas won its independence. She gifted it to the church, but if she had children to gift it to, they'd have to pay taxes on millions of dollars. Whether or not the land could produce that revenue or not, they would have to pay that tax anyway. I mean, it seems like we're being marshaled and pinned, corralled.
And you see, when a family doesn't have the concrete possibility to put up a farm for themselves and for their descendants, there's something wrong with the system. Yeah. And this is the type of socialism that we are having here in the West. We speak about socialism as if we're just in Soviet Union and Cuba problem. We also have the socialist mentality here, which is the statist mentality that denies. You mentioned that before, the principle of subsidiarity, and I was explaining in the post that we had. The subsidiary were the auxiliary troops of the Roman Empire, and the subsidiary stayed behind the lines and were called into battle to fill in any gaps that were made at the front. And that's the role of the higher institutions. It's a subsidiary role, not a leading role.
Yeah.
You know, Mr. Julio, one thing that I've heard many times, and I think this actually applies to the TFP, at least the attack, is, like they say, religious life is communist. They are taking the voluntary poverty, and the TFP, y'all receive stipends, y'all live in community, y'all have a more centralized community in terms of like the way your government structure works. So how can you condemn communism if you're living a communist lifestyle?
Well, that's the classical difference the church makes between the evangelical rules and the evangelical councils. Remember that rich young man who approached our Lord Jesus Christ and said, "What do I have to do to gain heaven?" And the Lord says, well, do this, this, and that. Well, that already do. I already do. And then he said, well, but if you want to be perfect, sell everything and come and join me. That's a counsel. And the church has always distinguished the rules from the counsel. For example, a counsel is to keep chastity. Chastity in the sense that not getting married. Well, what would happen to the world if nobody got married? I mean, that will be the end of it. So we have to distinguish that. Now, the counsels, the evangelical counsels, are the counsels for the so-called life of perfection. And they have a more religious content to it, but it's only for a few. For example, the general destiny of people is to get married and have children. Now, there's a small number of people who are called to live in celibacy. Priests, nuns, etc., or a lay person like us who chose celibacy. Why? In order to dedicate ourselves completely to the Catholic cause. But that's a distinction that we have to make between the evangelical rules, which are for everybody, and the evangelical counsels, which are for a few.
Yeah. All right. Well, Mr. Julio Laredo, we've been very grateful for your time today. Thank you for having an extended conversation. His book is Liberation Theology, How Marxism Infiltrated the Catholic Church. You can find it linked up at store.tfp.org. That's store.tfp.org. Check it out there. God bless you, Mr. Julio Laredo.
Thank you very much, and let's hope we can see ourselves very soon.
Yeah, praise be to God. Go to their Facebook page for details on his speaking tour. You can find that at facebook.com/tfp.south. And that's going to do it for today on Catholic Drive Time. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning. We're going to talk with George Neumeier. Until then, God love you.